This story is called The Beatles Around the World, 1964, Part 1, Temporarily Fat, or How I Learned to Emulate Ringo and Love the Screams. This is the story about their first world tour in 1964, primarily where they went to Australia. A little bit of a recap. Ringo fell ill and passed out at a press conference. And rather than cancel the tour or delay it and cancel a few dates, Brian and George Martin decided to find a replacement for the first leg of the tour and have Ringo join when he recovered. The other Beatles protested, primarily George, but the show must go on. Although I will say, imagine if it would have been John or Paul. I don't know. They would have said, yeah, let's just go and do it. I mean, I think the fact that it was Ringo definitely influenced. So they found Jimmie Nicol, and after a quick rehearsal with the Beatles, he came to EMI and they just ran through the songs. They left for a tour the next day, and he was on stage playing those songs with the Beatles. Apparently, I had learned this since we last talked about Nicol. He had recently been the drummer for an album called Beatlemania that had 14 note for note, play the credits, Beatles songs released on the Pi label. So he already knew the songs, so going through the rehearsals was a formality. So that's kind of convenient. And also, not only was he playing in Ringo's stead, but to make things worse, he was playing Ringo's kit, because they only took one along. Ringo was going to join later. And he wore Ringo's suit because they didn't have time to tailor a similar looking suit to fit in with the Beatles. Although the pants were too short. So he had to wear some different trousers. But I just feel like, it's like, sorry, Ringo, the band's still going to go. Oh, he's going to use your kit. Oh, and he's going to wear your clothes. Get well soon.
Long-suffering man. Insult to injury there.
Exactly. We start June 4th. We go to Denmark first. So over 6,000 fans gave them a warm reception when they arrived. But the Screams, as a change of pace, were mostly boys. The girls were shy, standing in the back, apparently. At the hotel, Mal Evans came up with a new way to give the set list to the band members. He tapes the set list onto their guitars. This is funny. I've read this fact in so many different, sources. It seems so unnotable to me, but it gets mentioned often enough. I feel like I had to mention it. So they just look at their guitar if they want to know what they're playing that day. Good job. They did 2 shows on that day to about 4,000 people apiece. Next stop, the Netherlands, June 5th and 6th. They got there, they did a TV show the first night, and during the second half of the TV show, they were performing Long Tall Sally, and the boys in the audience were getting a little antsy. They're getting a little riled up from all the Beatlemania, and they started to climb up on stage to get closer to the Beatles while they were playing. And they started playing She Loves You, and they were getting closer and closer, just like, oh, we're up on stage now, so now let's just stand right next to John and right next to Paul. Neil Aspinall, Mal Evans, and Derek Taylor tried to stop, tried to come in and push everyone away while they were playing, but they couldn't, so they had to stop the show. The Beatles were escorted out, but Jimmie Nicol, I guess determined to do his best, just stayed back, continuing to mime along to the song. They were lip syncing it or, miming it. So as the 3 Beatles left, he was just sitting there playing the drums all by himself. Good job, Jimmie. Later, they hit up the red light district. They were in Amsterdam. Jimmie Nicol was surprised with how hard the Beatles partied. He thought he could hang with the best of them, but they partied him out of the water. And, this was risky due to the fact that the Beatles were such high-profile people at the time, and it was, crazy that there wasn't some huge scandal at the time. We obviously have the stories now, but the newspapers didn't say, oh, drunken Lennon falls out of a brothel at 3 a.m. in the red light district. reasonably got suppressed. Apparently, the police needed to intervene to help avoid the scandal. Neil Aspinall says, "Just as we got there, the police rolled up. They literally tapped us on the shoulder and said, 'Naughty Beatles, back to your hotel,' as if we were schoolboys. And we said, 'Okay, fine.' They took us to the hotel, then John and I went straight out again and back into the red light district. When we came out again, it was dawn, and all the people were on their way to work." So, nice and well and hungover, the next morning, a boat collected them and drove them through the canals of Amsterdam and did a 10-mile trip through the Amstel Canal, and it took about 90 minutes, and there was 100 to 150,000 people in the streets watching them as they passed by in the canals. There were 6 police boats that accompanied them, busy picking up the dozens of boys who jumped into the canal and swam up to the boat. In fact, some even jumped off the overpass bridge onto the boat as it passed, which is insane. During this boat trip, they had seen people in Amsterdam wearing these capes on their coat. You can think of the Help album cover and the Help movie where they're wearing these capes, because this is the origin of those capes on that movie. They found it on these kids in Amsterdam, and they were like, "Oh my gosh, those are so awesome. We want some of those." Mal Evans, one of their roadies, go talk to that guy and figure out where he got that coat. Mal Evans jumps off the boat into the canal and swims up and goes and talks to the guy. So I'm not sure whether or not this was Mal's idea or not. Mal's biography implies that it was his idea, but it also seems like he was a little bit of a kicked around, and we know that the Beatles were kind of stingy paying their helpers and roadies and stuff like that. So for getting paid very little and for just kind of being their errand boy, him jumping into the canal, I guess, was just expected of him maybe. And even if it was his idea, probably was thinking, I want to please the Beatles, etc. So anyway, I'm saddened by Mal's story often when I read about it. But anyway, he jumped off the boat into the canal and he talked to the man with the cloak. 3 hours later, soaked to the bone, Mal shows back up at the hotel with the cloak. He bought it off the guy. Put a bookmark on that story. Keep your finger on that story for a second. Okay, Amsterdam to Hong Kong, June 8th through 10th. John's Aunt Mimi joins for this leg of the tour. Apparently that was John's idea, according to Tony Barrow. And she herself was a little reticent due to the distance, obviously, but was encouraged because she had some relatives that lived in New Zealand who she might have joined permanently if not for Julia's death. Like, there was a discussion of her going to live in New Zealand. But once Julia dies, she had to take care of John. Interestingly enough, I believe it was New Zealand that Alf, John's father, was talking about taking John to go live in New Zealand. So I guess that was just a popular place for people to want to move to at that time. When they arrived at the Kai Tak Airport in Hong Kong, they were escorted on the tarmac by the colonial police. So like British police from the British embassy or the British colony there, UK colony, and later performed to an entire audience of British military personnel and their families. So it's kind of confusing because they're like, we're in Hong Kong and we're playing to a bunch of British people. It's not what they expected. They went to the hotel to get some rest, but they found out that they were meant to take part in the Miss Hong Kong pageant that was happening at their hotel that night. They turned them down saying, we've just flown from Amsterdam, we're going to go to sleep. But they had such a strong reaction to them turning down that John felt compelled to go and make a brief appearance. Anyway, I think they were supposed to judge it as the Beatles, but John just came down and said hi, went up to his room and got some sleep. The next day, they had some performances at the Princess Theatre, but the ticket prices had been set to £7 per show per person for some reason. It wasn't clear who set the prices, but it was probably some promoter in Hong Kong. And there was a lot of reticence by China and Hong Kong at that time of the Beatles and what they were, letting them in. So it's certainly possible that the price was set intentionally high so that people could not come to see it. £7 was roughly about an average weekly income for a Hong Kong worker at the time. And during that visit, they brought the cape that Mal had found in Amsterdam and brought it to a local tailor, and they had a cape created for each Beatle there in Hong Kong. So, next up, Australia. And by the way, I don't know when to plug this, but I will say this. We had a guest on recently, Gareth, and he has a podcast with his friend, and they do a whole deep dive, extensive rundown of the Australian visit of the Beatles. So I'm only going to be touching on bullet points here, but if you want a whole podcast about that, go check them out. They came to a land down under. In any case, they went to Sydney on June 11th. There was 5,000 fans that had staged a vigil in the rainstorm when the Beatles landed, which, by the way, was like 2:30 in the morning at Mascot Airport. After they landed, they were pushed onto a flatbed truck, like a milk truck they called it, and were driven around in the weather that they were experiencing. There was a downpour. So they got on the back of this truck and were given umbrellas, which immediately were ripped out of their hands because of the violent storms and winds. And the capes that they wore had a weird dye in them. The rain made the dye stain their skin a dark blue.
Oops.
Among the crowd came to greet them was a group that called themselves the New South Wales Anti-Trash Society, and they held up signs that said, "Go home, bugs." One of the first indications of not everyone receiving them well and maybe even endangering their lives, which we'll get to in later stories. Also in the crowd was even a sociology lecturer and his students with the intent of examining the facets of teenage behavior while they arrived, which I thought was quite funny. Anyway, they arrive, they get dyed blue, and they go back to the hotel where the Beatles slept. Jimmie Nicol himself left to visit some relatives, some second cousins and great aunt and uncle. Everyone's got a relative here down under. But when he came back to the hotel, he didn't have his wallet or a security pass. And he's like, "I am a Beatle." And they're like, "Sounds good. Bye." So he had to have someone come down from the hotel and say, "Yeah, he's actually with us." And later that night, he left again, because again, he's not the Beatles. The Beatles can't go out. The Beatles have to stay in their hotel, otherwise they'll get mobbed. No one knows Jimmie Nicol, so he goes out, and he goes to see an American cabaret singer, speaking of cabaret, named Frances Faye. And when he went there, she was immediately alerted that Nicol was in the audience and asked him to come play a song. So he went up and played a song, the drums with her. And then when he went to go back to his seat, the whole bar erupted, saying, "Oh no, get back on there." And so he went back onto the drums and played a 2-hour set that night, including a 10-minute finale, which got people on their feet applauding the whole time. So part-time Beatle, part-time cabaret drummer, Jimmie Nicol. And then they went to Adelaide, June 12th through 13th. Epstein mentions that there was a petition signed by 80,000 people to have the Beatles come to Adelaide. And that's why that they went to Australia at all. When they arrived, the weather was much better than Sydney, but there was no one at the airport, which confused the Beatles. They were used to, at this point, thousands of people gathering, waiting to see them. But this was a decision made by the police that no one could come onto the airport grounds. So instead, they drove a convoy to their hotel on the Anzac Highway, and there were 250 to 330,000 people. I've heard many different numbers, but somewhere in the 300,000 people waiting along the highway during the entire 9-mile stretch, which apparently is about half of the city's population. They made a stop at Town Hall for a little press conference introduction with the mayor of the city. And then they went off to their hotel room. The sight of all those people was too much for Mimi. It was so overwhelming for her and to the Beatles themselves. They thought about the recent Kennedy assassination. You know, they're driving in a car and there's all these people and they don't know who's there looking at them. They said that John was even emotional at the town hall press conference thing just because he was so overwhelmed with how many people for everything that they had seen up until this point. There was no greater crowds than Australia to receive them, and it just was crazy. And they were very friendly to the Beatles in general, so super significant moment for them. And in Adelaide, Nicol played his last shows with the Beatles, 4 shows over 2 nights in Adelaide. And then he went home, and Ringo gets picked up, and that's where the story's going to continue tomorrow. But I'll just end with this little anecdote of Aunt Mimi. At some point, Aunt Mimi had told a television reporter that John was bad at math as a kid. So then after that, John got asked that a million times, why he was bad at math. And so one reporter said, if you're so bad at math, how do you count all your money? And he says, I don't count it, I weigh it.